So just as a reminder, we'll be doing some polls and word clouds on Slido, so please do use Slido. Please do ask questions as we go, and I'll start looking at them when we get on to our panel discussion to bring in your topics to our fabulous panellists. I'm Janet Cooper. I chair a number of remuneration committees and I'm on a number of boards. So I'm a panellist as well as the moderator today. Started my working life as a lawyer specialising in this area of reward and employee incentives. And I'm delighted to be joined by Amanda. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Amanda Moore, Head of Reward at OVO Energy, so energy sector UK based.
Thank you very much.
Susie Godfrey, I'm the Head of Performance and Reward for the EMEA region for Norton Rose Fulbright. We're a law firm, about 2,000 people across the region.
And Scott Cullen from KPMG is just going to give an introduction to the topic before we start our conversation. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Janet. Afternoon, everyone. As Janet says, I'm Scott Cullen. I'm a partner in the reward consulting practice at KPMG. And I'm going to do a quick introduction on some of the key macroeconomic and political trends that we've seen over the last few years that are driving reward trends now. And we'll try and predict what we think is going to happen over the next couple of years around that. And on the second line of this slide, I think these are some of the key impacts that these have had on workers and employers, and then we'll have a look at the reward impact of those shortly. So first of all, our post-pandemic, we saw a significant withdrawal of the workforce, and some of those have come back, but actually many haven't. And with Brexit, we also saw a reduction in labour supply coming from the EU. We've still got 900,000 vacancies in the UK, even after a flat economy for the last 9 months. So that's still going to be an issue. We've also seen inflation, as you've all seen. It's come down this week, but it's been very high for the last couple of years. And that's led to a cost of living crisis. And that combined with the pandemic has led to a lot of well-being issues, both financial and mental, for employees. We've seen changing employee expectations. Employees not only leaving the workforce, but rethinking what they want from work and life. And we saw the first mass home working during the pandemic, and that's led to what we see now with a lot of organisations using hybrid working, although there are a number of organisations trying to reverse that at the moment, particularly in the financial services sector. And technology is rapidly changing, and that's changing the types of roles that we need in organisations. Over the last 5 to 10 years, we've all seen the impact of moving online and the impact that's had on retail. And now we've got generative AI and other technological changes that are coming, and all companies at the moment are thinking about what's the impact of Gen AI, how can I make my organisation more productive through the use of it? And this is where HR really needs to be the strategic partner around that initiative. So what's the impact on reward of these changes that we've seen? So immediately, again, post-pandemic and after Brexit, we saw acute talent shortages, and in areas that we weren't used to them. So manufacturing, warehouse, lorry drivers, we were seeing 50% pay increases. And as I mentioned earlier, in the flat economy, that's all eased off in the last couple of years, although employers do say it's still really difficult to attract talent. But as I mentioned before, we've still got 900,000 vacancies. That's 120,000 higher than pre-COVID. And this week, inflation's come back down to 2%. The Bank of England's unlikely to cut interest rates this week, but we will start to see interest rate cuts this year. We're already seeing a pickup in deals and investment activity, and there's going to be a big increase in demand for employees and talent across the board. At the same time, both Labour and the Conservatives are talking about reducing skilled immigration. So we might see an even further reduction in talent supply. So with increased demand, reduced supply, we're going to definitely see a real war on talent again over the next few years. And that is going to be a challenge, and that's going to put pressure on pay effectively. The high inflation we've seen has driven big increases in national living wage. And that's good for the financial well-being of those on the lowest paid, clearly, but it's had a big impact on the roles above. It's squashing the pay of the lowest paid up against other roles in organisations, and that's where the issues are sitting now. I've been talking to some employers recently, some of which were on real living wage and have had to move off of it to provide pay increases for others within the workforce. So that will be an interesting topic to talk about today. We've seen a demand for flexibility. And again, I think this started again with the home working, with the hybrid working. And in fact, KPMG ran a survey of 4,000 workers recently, and that showed that flexibility now after pay and benefits is the biggest driver of retention in organisations, so really important for reward packages. And then finally, with technology, we're seeing changing demand for skills and really high demand for certain skill sets, which is causing really high pay premiums for certain types of roles and certain types of skills. So software engineers with AI capability, for instance. So that's driving these pay premiums, and it's making organisations think about pay for skills, and that's only going to become more acute. The demand for technology talent is not going to go away, and this is leading to a focus on skills and skills architecture in organisations. What skills are required, where can we get them, and how can we make better use of our existing workforce? And that, again, is leading to thoughts around skills-based pay. On the other hand, we've got legislative changes, and that's focusing us more on equality. Particularly in the EU, we've recently seen the EU directive on pay transparency, but we've also seen some huge equal pay claims in the UK over the last few years, particularly in retail and in some of the councils we've seen where the claims are in the billions. And I think if Labour win the election as predicted, we might see more legislative changes going that way, I would say. We're also seeing a greater demand from employees in a number of areas around benefits. So particularly around diversity and inclusion, ESG and lifestyle. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those on a later slide. But I think there's two really key implications from some of these changes and predicted changes that we're seeing. And the first of those is really around having effective reward structures. And by effective reward structures, I mean grading structure, probably underpinned by a job evaluation tool, a job architecture, and newer, a skills architecture. And there's lots of areas I've highlighted on this slide where these elements are critical, but there's two that I'm going to talk about in particular today. And the first is the impact of the legislation I've talked about. Many of you may already have grading structures in place. You might have job architecture in place, and it might be underpinned by job evaluation. But when was the last time that was really tested for you as an organisation? Because this legislation that's coming in will test your architecture. The key implication of it is that pay will be more visible. Employees will be able to see their pay in conjunction with others. And what this will mean is that any anomalies in your pay systems will come out at that point. And what we tend to see, we've worked with a lot of organisations recently auditing these types of structures, and often what's happened is a structure will be put in place maybe 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, and over time governance isn't followed or political decisions are made and these anomalies build up. And those anomalies will drive pay risk, and as pay becomes more visible, that will drive issues. So this is the time to really think about, is your structure effective, and review that. The second point is around the AI point I was making earlier. To really understand how AI can support your business, you need to understand the structure of the organisation. And what progressive organisations are doing is using their job architecture to understand where AI could come in and support the business, where it could enhance, where it could replace, and so on. Now, if the architecture you've got is poor, the results that come out of that are going to be poor as well. And this is really the chance that HR has to become the strategic partner around this. Alongside that, adding a skills architecture is adding a whole level of depth to the data that can be used around that. And by a skills architecture, I mean skills attached to employees, but also attached to the roles in your organisation. So having that type of architecture in place, again, is going to become more and more important for organisations to have.
Scott, 2 minutes. That's all right.
Thank you. And what we've seen with those skills architectures as well, they're also being used to drive talent marketplace type applications. And again, with a reduction in the supply of talent and labour and skills that we're seeing in the market, being able to better utilise your workforce is a really critical element within that. And then the final area I just want to highlight, again, and probably most connected to the REBA theme of today, is that with the existing talent shortages that we've got and the likely pressure on pay that we will see over the next couple of years, having a modern, attractive total reward architecture package is really important. And what we're seeing is trends in 3 main areas around D&I, lifestyle and ESG. And clearly there's crossover points on all of those. And a modern package needs to reflect those. We've seen very strong trends around wellbeing and health, and I'm sure you've heard lots of that today. KPMG ran a reward study last year. 71% of companies said they were focusing on wellbeing. But within that, things like flexibility are absolutely huge. I've already talked about flexibility, but being flexible around your package, being around flexible around where people work, has a huge impact not only on lifestyle, but on D&I. And if you can hit those intersections, that's where the package is going to be really, really interesting and important. So in summary, I think we are going to see a lot of pressure on pay over the next couple of years. We're going to see legislative change, and we're going to see the increased use of technology. So a really thought through approach to total reward is needed, and effective structures will be needed to drive the take-up of AI and dealing with the legislation that we've seen. And with that, I'm going to hand back over to Janet.
Thanks very much, Scott. Really interesting. We're going to go into those topics in more detail now with our expert panel. Obviously, Scott, with that broad experience in consulting, and 2 very different sectors here, the legal sector and energy in a regulated sector. And from my perspective, on the board of a number of organisations, Nurture Landscapes, which is we do grounds maintenance and other similar services up and down the country in the UK, as well as being on the Remuneration Committee of a number of other organisations in the non-profit sector. So let's have a look at the word cloud first. So if you go into Slido, we're going to ask you, what are the current issues for pay and reward strategies that you see? What's the main issue that you're seeing? Transparency is coming up as the big one. Flexibility versus cost. Cost, yes, big one. Compression, that's a really interesting one. Yes, I'm seeing quite a bit of that. Transparency is still up there. Cost, yeah, we've still got that cost of living crisis and pressure on costs. Salary inflation, affordability, probably related there to cost. Affordability for early career. National minimum wage. We're going to cover that specifically today. National living wage, definitely. Cost of living. Any more before we start discussing these? And we're covering these in our session this afternoon. So cost is one of the big issues, and transparency. So let's move on to our first question. And Amanda, in this regulated sector, green energy and all the wonderful stuff that OVO is doing, what are you seeing as the driving reward packages at the moment? What's the key issues?
Yeah, I think what most people have seen on there is also the similar things to what we're facing. I'm sure we'll deep dive into them in a bit more detail shortly, but pay transparency is huge for us. How we are being transparent externally, but also internally to make sure we're retaining and attracting the best talent. And then national minimum wage and the impact of that and that increasing, and how that flows through to real living wage and the real living wage foundation rates that we pay.
Yeah. Susie?
I think cost and compression for us, that definitely resonates with me. So The legal market is very competitive, and we're seeing that at the moment through, this renewed war for talent. So we are constantly thinking about how we can compete on a salary and total reward package as well. So what we can do, and we're also trying to balance that with increasing costs of benefits and medical provision. So I think increasingly we're trying to do more with less, and that's a big thing for us. And the compression point as well, I think in the legal sector especially, kind of trainee and newly qualified salaries are quite public, so it's very obvious to a lot of our people what they can get paid at a firm down the road, and I think our more senior people are feeling that compression because we can't just exponentially increase all of our salaries all of the time. So that's a big issue for us at the moment.
Yeah, and actually just to put that in context, in the legal sector, the American firms went in there at £180,000 a year for a 24-year-old newly qualified lawyer, and then the UK legal market then responded with about 150,000 and offering more benefits and things like that. And then not all law firms can offer that, and as you say, you've got to be more creative then about creating the right environment. So it's not just about the money, it's about...
Exactly. What else are we offering? Why do people want to work for us instead of one of those firms? And I think we also have to be mindful that we aren't solely made up of lawyers as well. We've got other people who are very experienced in other areas of the business, and that can be quite hard to balance when you're talking about 24-year-olds coming in and commanding these huge salaries. And so we have to think about how we can try and keep everyone engaged and motivated.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly from my perspective at Nurture Landscapes, where we have a lot of people who are frontline doing grounds maintenance on real living wage, and we have to be manage our costs very carefully, but it's creating the right environment. And one of our key things is to recognition. We talked about that in some of the sessions this morning. Recognition is key, and we're just launching a new one. And for me, that's the right thing. We want to look out for people and say thank you. And this just gives you that extra way of doing that in a more constructive way. And I love data, and actually when we can see how it's being used, we can see who are the stars shining that we as managers above there might not be seeing it, and actually who's not getting recognised and why, and is it a whole location that's not recognising each other. There's a lot more to a recognition scheme than just saying thank you. So I'm really excited about this next level of recognition scheme that we're putting in, as well as very clearly focusing on communications about the value of the rewards that we do have, giving access to them, making sure that people understand that we've got a cycle to work scheme, that we've got a discount scheme, so that as we have this cost of living crisis, that it's still there, particularly for the lower paid workers, that we're doing other things to add value to working for us. So I think it's not just about the money, it's about making the money work well, and use the data to make sure that we can see what other stories it's telling us. And Scott, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that obviously cost is the biggest factor that's come up on there. And interesting hearing the story, and already knowing the story about law firms and the inflation on salaries there. But the interesting thing is there are some law firms that don't compete in that way, and they don't pay those salaries, but they don't ask for the same amount of chargeable hours either. So it's a very different approach, much more about work-life balance. So there isn't only one way of doing things, I would say, and you don't always have to go to the highest cost. And in fact, from pay, most organisations can't afford to go to the highest cost. So that's where you've got to really look at your overall package and think, are there other things we can do that are really valued that aren't super expensive? And that might mean getting rid of some old legacy benefits that have been around that aren't being used. I've seen some presentations today where people have talked about not understanding statistics or understanding the value of their benefits. That is pretty important, understanding the take-up, how much people use them, how much they cost, and then balancing that against the overall package. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is important.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that we're doing in one of the organisations where the Remuneration Committee Chair is doing a survey on rewards. What do you think about the rewards that we're offering? And we list some. Do you know about them? Do you want them? Should we do something different? And that's providing you really useful feedback to make sure that we are spending the money well, and we're actually communicating the benefits that are available. I'm just going to do a show of hands. answer, because I didn't do a Slido on this, but how many of you are currently doing that assessment? Are you surveying your employees saying, have we got the rewards right? Oh, right, okay. Yeah, so a number of us here doing it, and I think it's probably now is the time, because we're assuming we're getting it right, but you know, they've got their own views on what's right for them. So let's move on and have a look at transparency. You know, it's a big issue now, isn't it? We've already touched on, and clearly an issue coming up for you. Let's do a Slido here, and the question here is, do you show pay ranges in job adverts or disclose it to your employees when you're looking to fill a vacancy? So let's put that, that question up, and let's just see how many of you, not necessarily for all roles, but you are now getting more transparent and you're disclosing what the pay range is. So I'm just curious to see how we're going on that Slido. Any results yet? Is it on? Oh, here we go. There we go. Thank you very much. So do we publish in job adverts, publish to employees? Publish not, don't, so basically don't publish. 63% at the moment. Publish both, job adverts into employees. So at the moment, on the whole, not very transparent. So obviously, it's a hot issue, because obviously that is now coming in. Some of the organisations I'm involved in, and one of them's a government's remuneration committee, we absolutely have to publish the range, and actually I think it's quite helpful. So, thoughts on this in terms of designing structures to get pay transparency right and avoid the disasters? Scott, any thoughts on this? And in terms of the regulation coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just build a little bit on the presentation I did earlier. I mean, interestingly, we ran this poll, exact same poll last year. Different group, obviously, and I think we only had 17% publishing at the time. So maybe it's gone up slightly, maybe it's just a different audience, but it's still very few. So people aren't ready for it. In the UK, you don't have to, and you won't have to necessarily, so the directive isn't coming here, but actually I'm seeing a really strong demand for this from organisations right across the UK, whether they've got European operations or not. For me, the main thing is when you have to get your structures right. I've already mentioned that, so re-looking at those structures is the starting point of this. Make sure your structures are right. Then you really need to run an equal pay audit to understand where you are against equal pay, because that is coming as well. And then after that, it's really important to have good governance in place to make sure these things are managed. And if you can, use of technology, you know, when you're hiring people, enabling you to have information about those decisions and the impact that's having on equal pay. Again, I think those are all critical things in the future.
So do you think with the transparency rules coming in Europe, and if you're a global or European organisation, it will put pressure on you more so because you're disclosing what you're paying your colleagues in France? Would you have to feel that you have to disclose?
I mean, a lot of the multinationals I've spoken to are saying that they're going to do the same thing everywhere. So regardless, they're not just going to do it in Europe, they're going to do it right across the organisation.
Yeah.
So they're interested in it across the board. But I mean, the thing that amazes me actually, that there are UK companies that are UK domestic companies that are more interested in than some of the European organisations I speak to at the moment.
Yeah.
So there's some countries are really hot on it, and others are, at the moment, I think, are waiting to see.
Yeah, because we saw that with gender pay gap reporting, didn't we? The UK was at it first, and actually most of those UK companies rolled it out globally because you couldn't really do the data and disclose anything meaningful without doing it globally.
Yeah.
So Amanda, what's your experience on pay transparency?
Yeah, so we've started doing it at OVO, so we advertise our salary ranges on all job adverts, and we share our salary ranges internally with our people. And I'm finding it's a bit like Marmite. People either love it or they hate it. It's definitely causing some problems and causing some challenging conversations, because people tend to, what we see is, aim for the top of the band and want to know how they can get there, and that's not always going to be the case for all of those roles. So we do lots of education to support that transparency. A lot of it's about governance as well, and I think what's really important for reward teams is when you're building pay philosophies, when you're building pay ranges and pay frameworks, you're documenting the behind the scenes why. so that when somebody comes and replaces your role in the future and they're taking on this piece of work and moving forward for the organisation, they understand the why behind what you've done. So I think sometimes it's really hard to unpick the why we've made the decision that we have. So yeah, it's really interesting. We're doing lots of education around, how people would progress through for a pay band. And it's definitely opening up the discussion around internal and external hires. So, it's quite normal. We know that people move externally and get higher pay increases, and actually really starting to give managers more autonomy to understand, well, if you make that decision about that external hire, this is the impact it's going to have on your internal people, and are you okay with that? And are you going to start forecasting and planning from a workforce perspective and budgets for years to come to be able to close that gap?
And what's your experience when there is an external hire and the decision is made to, go a little bit above and beyond because you want that person? What's your policy internally about then looking at everybody else that perhaps should be lifted as well, so there isn't such a gap? What's the approach at OVO?
Yeah, I think you first of all need to understand the why. So why have we decided to pay that person more money than the rest of the team or higher in the pay range? And is that why justified? And if it's not, then we need to close the gap. And how are we going to do that? And just saying we can't afford to do it isn't the right answer. We need to start thinking about it and budgeting for it. And having some really honest conversations in that space.
Because that's a really important issue, isn't it? Can you afford it? What I found is I was chair of a remuneration committee of a very large charity, and in the last 3 or 4 years we've had very significant pay inflation, haven't we?
Yeah.
And within organisations, that pay inflation hasn't necessarily kept up. If you've had 3 or 4 or 5% pay rises, but actually in the market, particularly for certain skill sets, it's run away. And so it does bring those challenges in that it may be exactly the job that you're looking to recruit, but we actually haven't kept up pace. So it does bring those challenges back internally to go, we're not paying market rate now, we need to look at it.
Yeah.
So, and Susie, what's your experience? Because actually in the legal sector, it is quite transparent in that the journalists report on it anyway.
Yes. Yes, I think the newly qualified rate, absolutely, very transparent. I think beyond that, you get more into that discretionary increase area, and we do have kind of bands, going through up until people make partner. We don't publish those either on job adverts or internally. We take a very similar approach in terms of, if we need to recruit someone in and it's outside of our band, we try and push back on that as much as possible. We do try and have quite a rigid structure. We do a lot of pay moderation to make sure that we're really comfortable with where people are sitting in the pay bands. What we're not very good is answering employee questions on that. So when we get questions from employees around, well, what is the pay band and where do I sit in the pay band and what can I do to influence how I get to the top of that pay band, we don't tend to have those conversations. They're, shut down quite quickly, I would say. But I think Gen Z, especially coming in, they expect more transparency. It's something we get asked for all the time, and I think that kind of standpoint of it's done behind the scenes, you've got to trust us, is not going to cut it for much longer, especially with the legislation coming in across Europe. I think we'll be under even more pressure to be more transparent. So it's something we're preparing for, and I think it wouldn't actually be as bad as managers anticipate, because we do all of that moderation. We are comfortable with where people are paid. It's just the conversation doesn't happen and people are nervous of that conversation and what it means.
Yeah. And I think these days they will talk amongst each other. So there's that expectation if they think they're being underpaid or not being paid fairly, then they'll come and have those conversations now. Whereas maybe 10 years ago they wouldn't. But we expect it now. And as you said, you do need to document it to make sure that you're making the fair decisions, but you've also got that paper trail should there be a claim of discrimination in some way.
Yeah, and I think when people are deciding their transparency strategy, whether it be about pay or other elements of your total reward package, I think it's a sliding scale. Like, it's not black or white, so you're not transparent or you are transparent or you're not transparent. It's not really the case. Like, you can be transparent on some things with some people. You don't have to be transparent with everything with everyone. And I think that's really important as well, to decide who are your stakeholders here in this situation, and what are you going to tell them about what information.
Yeah. Can I just ask one other quick question follow up here? Do you, when people are applying for jobs, do you ask them to tell you what their remuneration is, or are you doing this blind now? Because I know there's a trend coming in, certainly from the States, where they're not required to give you what their pay level is. So, Susie, do you ask for their pay range?
I don't think we have a blanket policy on that, but I think we are starting to move away from those kind of questions, because ultimately it's almost irrelevant. We need to have the conversation about what we're looking for in the role and what we're willing to pay. And if that doesn't work for someone, you need to kind of get to that point quite quickly, I think, because otherwise you do end up with those situations where you're making exceptions because you've gone so far down the road with a particular candidate. So I think we are starting to ask that less, but we're kind of being a bit more open. You know, when someone does apply and they're starting those conversations, we'll at that point say, well, this is roughly what we're looking at. How does that match with your expectations?
Yeah, and we ask salary expectations, not what they're actually previously earning.
Okay. That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, so we ask what your expectations are for this role, and obviously they would know the pay range when they apply for the position as well. So it's interesting to see where people position themselves in that range and what their expectations are when they've already got that information.
Thank you for that. Now, one of the other issues that came up on the word cloud was cost and national minimum wage. Now, Amanda, I know you've got a lot of people in OVO that will be on that lower pay range. How is that impacting on you when we've seen such significant increases in the last couple of years?
Yeah, so OVO have consistently been a real living wage foundation employer for a number of years, and in most cases have paid more than that real living wage foundation rate. However, with the significant increases we've seen in national minimum wage, which has flowed through to real living wage over the last few years, this is the first time in a couple of years we've had to actually increase people's minimum rate to continue to have the accreditation. And I think that's really challenging for lots of organisations in many different reasons and ways, but particularly for us where we can't pass on our costs to the consumer. We have a price cap, we have to work within the price cap. So I think it's really challenging, and I'm seeing the same in like the hospitality sector where, you know, organisations are having to reduce staff numbers to continue to pay these increases in rates of pay. It's also having a huge impact on that kind of entry professional and team leader kind of tier, where those rates of pay haven't gone up in the same way, and therefore we've seen that compression. And we see, you know, is it worth it to take the promotion for such, in some instances, a small salary difference?
Yeah. Yeah. And Scott, what's been your experience in advising your clients in terms of national minimum wage, real living wage? Are they still supportive of it or having concerns?
National minimum wage, there's no choice. And obviously we do a lot of work around compliance on national minimum wage to make sure that employers are paying it, because the revenue is starting to go after employers for people that do unpaid overtime now. And if they're they might be considerably above minimum wage, but if they do a lot of unpaid overtime, that can put them down below minimum wage, and then you end up on the list. So that's an area of concern. But what I'm hearing from my clients is just this squashing of pay up into the next level, and that's where the issues are now going to be. How do we deal with those people that perhaps didn't get pay rises for the last couple of years because they couldn't afford it? And what are they going to do with those employees now? I think it's going to involve quite a lot of planning around what do we expect national minimum wage to do over the next few years, what can we do for those other employees, but it's not an easy one to get around, to be honest.
Susie, have you got any thoughts on this? And just probably come on to Susie, we're just asking for the questions to come up so that we can start addressing lots of questions that are coming in. So Susie, any issues in the legal sector with lower paid workers?
Not so much, I would say. We do have a handful of those kind of entry-level professional roles, so paralegals without any experience, we are kind of almost at that point, but we do try and pay above the Living Wage Foundation, and we try and add on a bit extra so that people can, go into the salary sacrifice pension scheme, for example. So it's something that we're mindful of, but it doesn't have a huge impact for us, I would say.
Yeah, and in my business, Nurture Landscapes is absolutely critical to us. We've got probably around 40% of our workers on those lower pay grades. They're out there cutting the grass and looking after trees and all sorts of wonderful things up and down the country. So absolutely essential that we've committed to paying real living wage. But as a result, and we're not regulated like OVO, we've actually put it in our contracts. It's important to us that we pay our workers at least the real living wage. and the London weighting, which you don't get in the national minimum wage, that we have that in a review every year with our contracts to make sure that we can continue paying it. But yes, it's certainly a consideration, and probably will continue to be so as we try and get this levelling up in the country. So let's just have a quick look at some of the questions that's coming in before we get onto a question around ESG. Popular question here, in terms of scrapping legacy benefit, in terms of scrapping legacy benefits, what are you typically seeing being dropped or at risk of being dropped? Now I'm going to ask you, Scott, what are you seeing? Anything's falling out of favour?
So what we tend to see is schemes that I think are overcomplicated with too many benefits in, particularly where someone's got a flexible benefits scheme. And all of those benefits cost money, and a lot of them might have, or some of them may have very low take-up. And I think it's reviewing that, understanding where you've got low take-up and where there's costs, and taking those types of benefits out. The other areas, I mean, even around things like pensions, what's your pension rate? Are you getting good value for that? Are there other things you could be offering instead? ISAs, those types of things, etc. I think there's a variety of areas you could look at.
Yeah. Amanda, are you looking at anyone's falling out of favour that you're going to drop off the list?
Not really saying names, but yeah, we're constantly doing that data review and that data analysis. I think it's really important to keep in touch with what your people want and need. And if you've got something in your proposition that's not serving a purpose or adding any value, then whether it's employee funded or employer funded, it's still costing the business money. So it's important to keep that review on the top of the list.
Yeah, I think one that we've got, which is a real throwback to pre-COVID, is a subsidised gym membership for a gym very near the office. Now, we get the feedback all the time that doesn't work for people anymore. They don't want to go to the gym when they're in the office. They want more flexibility on that. So that's one that we're looking at as to what we do with that. Do we remove the subsidy? Do we do something a bit more creative in terms of flexibility and, giving people money they can dip into for different types of things, whether it's, classes or a different gym membership. So that's one we're looking at.
Yeah, and I think what I'm seeing is not necessarily dropping, but we might not be putting up the pay as much, but we're looking to make sure we have a good suite of benefits, because as I think you said earlier, it's not all about the money coming to the office, it's actually having that feeling that this is the place you want to be, it's the purpose of the organisation, it's giving you the extra things that you might need, and each person's different. So not necessarily dropping them off, but just trying to get value for money from them, and making sure people know that they're there. There's just looking at the questions that are coming up here. Let's have a look. What do you see as a low take-up percentage? Actually, do you have a criteria for low take-up? We certainly don't. Even if just a few people want it and it's pay per user, it's value for money, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think it depends on the size of your organisation as well. We're 4,500 people, so if a handful of people were just using it, although it's not costing us anything, somebody's still paying an invoice every month, and every time we need to make a change on our flexible benefits platform, it costs us money. So I think there just need to be, we don't have a percentage, but I think there does need to be something in mind. And I think it's just how it ranks from the rest of your benefits as well. Like, is it in that bottom three?
And would you look at it and say, well, do they know we've got it?
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things when the cost of living crisis hit. Lots of companies had discount schemes, but nobody knew they existed or had log-ons. And then they suddenly got relaunched. And actually then they got a big take-up.
Yeah, and we've just been doing that recently with some of our benefits that are on that lower usage around, like, let's recommunicate and relaunch them first. Let's see how they land before we then make some decisions.
Yeah. Now, I'm just going to move on to one more question, and then we'll see if we've got time, we'll come back to some more here. So our question is how ESG weaves into reward and impacts ESG reporting. So it's a really big topic in itself, but in terms of nurture, because of who we are, we're looking after green spaces. It's absolutely critical. It's in the DNA of the organisation. We have an ESG fund, so our giving is related to anything to do with E, S or G, and employees can ask for that. Wearing another hat that I have, which is chair of ProShare, I'm really passionate about employee share ownership. And I noticed that quite a number of companies regard making shares available to employees rather than just the executives, that can be part of the ESG, that they're bringing their employees in as partners of the business. They've got shares in the business in some way. And I'm just curious here, how many of your companies make shares available to your employees rather than just your executives? Very good. So I don't know whether you regard that as an ESG, social, but a number of companies do. So I think that's a good proportion here. Amanda, have you got any thoughts on ESG, how it weaves into reward and impacts on ESG reporting?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think we've seen a spike and then we've seen a dip back down again. But where I think it's very different for us as our organisation. We are it's part of our core DNA and our purpose as a green energy provider, and therefore it's intertwined in all of our benefits. We have a Plan Zero benefits proposition where we have lots of different products and services, some of our own and some external. So I think it's different for us because of the purpose of our business.
Susie?
I think for us, we're fairly limited in what we can do from a benefits perspective. So we did have a car leasing scheme. We're now reviewing that to see if we do move to electric vehicles only under that scheme. We've been looking at our pension default fund. Is that still appropriate? And then other things that we do have are more around kind of volunteering days that we offer people, allowing our lawyers a certain amount of time on pro bono projects, which can still feed into their chargeable hours bonus. So there's things like that which kind of weave through what we do, but I would agree, I think it's not as front and centre as maybe it was as a topic a couple of years ago.
Yeah, because there's those ESG benefits, and there's a question here about what ESG benefits can you offer beyond the electric vehicles, and Susie, I think you've touched on that. But Scott, have you got any thoughts about that? Any other ESG benefits as opposed to ESG reporting?
Yeah, I guess I'll just start slightly higher level. I mean, we do see ESG in executive reward, and that's where it's become quite common. And it's spiked up there, as you say, and then I think that's where we see it. I think ESG is such a broad term that lots of things can fit in there. And I think the three circles I showed you earlier that were interlinking, certainly anything to do with D&I and anything to do with that ESG side, you could argue would go into ESG. So even the most basic, obvious benefits like having a good maternity policy is going to drive better diversity in the organisation, having more flexibility about the way people work, the hours they work, where they work, and so on, again, drives more diversity. And you could argue all of those things are related to ESG. Beyond that, obviously, electric vehicles is the one in the question there, and that's an obvious one. But even things like having ethical funds within your pension scheme. So Sanjit on our stall downstairs is a pensions expert. I was talking to about this earlier. He was mentioning that a lot of organisations have big banners on ESG, then you go into their pension schemes and there's nothing there about the way the pensions are invested. So they're not following through on those big statements, and there's a mismatch. And obviously we could hear how important that was to you, Amy, but it's in your organisation. So.
Yeah. And just again, quick show of hands. How many of you have executive incentive schemes, whether it's shares or cash, that have some linkage, some performance measure relative to your an ESG target, whether it's environment, whether it's social diversity and inclusion, whether it's governance? How many don't have it? Okay. So about 3/4 have some link to ESG, and I think that's our experience, isn't it? And I used to report on this when I was a partner in the law firm where we specialised in this. We saw a quick drive up to linking D&I to some level of incentive payment, and then environmental figures started coming in, and started seeing a drop-off then, because I think it just got too difficult to either measure and report alongside the other reporting. So be an interesting one to see how this evolves over time, whether we carry on linking ESG to some level of incentive.
I think the cost of living crisis is probably one of the reasons that it's dropped off a bit in the inflation we've seen. That's my feeling around it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining this session. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we've shed some light on some things. And then Scott will be on the KPMG booth downstairs if you want to catch up with him on any more questions. We're around for a little while longer if there's anything else that we can help with. And please do mark us, and hope to see you later this afternoon for drinks. Thanks very much.